Thank you, Chair, and my apologies to the committee and to the witnesses for being late, and therefore I am all the more grateful for the printed version of Professor Zine's remarks. Professor Zine, I have read about your work. I won't pretend to have read the report, but I have read about it in the newspapers and in academic releases. And you talk about your conclusions that Islamophobia is an organized, orchestrated, networked, monetized industry. I wonder if you would comment on the role of legislation in the roots of Islamophobia in this country, and I refer particularly to the anti-terrorism code that was passed in 2001 by Prime Minister Chrétien, and subsequently, around 2011, Prime Minister Harper approved the risk assessment against dealing with money laundering and terrorism financing. This brings the entire machinery of government, CBSA, RCMP, CSIS, CRA, IRCC, all of them around the risk assessment framework, which we have heard is part of systemic racism in systemic Islamophobia in Canada. We heard earlier from Munia Mazik that after the rendition of Meher Hirar and his subsequent release, not a single thing changed in the anti-terrorism code. I wonder if you'd like to comment on the role of legislation and legislators as part of this constellation of the industry.
Thank you very much for that question. And I think your question is really an important one. I did mention earlier about, how the government needs to reflect upon its own policies and their consequences when it comes to tackling Islamophobia. And security policies and the wider security industrial complex that's attached to it also are very important as part of that. You've mentioned the Anti-Terrorism Act. There's also security certificates, right, that were applied to non-citizens and, really sort of operate around secret trials and secret evidence and so on. And that has affected Muslim men in this country, obviously, issues of extraordinary rendition. And there's a number of other ways in which there are questions around certain cases to do with entrapment and all sorts of other things that have specifically affected Muslim populations. And so legislation is, when it sets out to security agencies are directing their attention on particular groups in society, then those groups are singled out in the wider public as well as being in need of surveillance. We need to watch them. We need to monitor them. They could be threats. And so these, for me as a sociologist, it's the way those legislations support and sustain and reproduce Islamophobic ideas and narratives about the potential radical, the jihadist. In my book, Under Siege, Islamophobia and the 9/11 Generation that came out last year, I was looking at Muslim youth and how they are responding to having been socialized into a world where they were perceived as radicals, as terrorists, as jihadists since 9/11 happened, and all of those security policies were ushered in. There's a number of ways in which that has impacted this generation of youth and the generation of youth that has followed. And so for me, it is not just the legislation itself, and that's been, widely critiqued. And it's also looking at what is the effect on communities and how is that taken up and what message does it send to wider publics about particular groups being, criminalized, being seen as radicals and potential threats. And so I think we need to look at it more broadly, not just in terms of what is legislated, but what is the impact of that surveillance. And, like Dr. Perry said, I have found in my research with Muslim youth across Canada, how they tend to internalize that securitization. They tend to, worry about if what they're doing would be suspicious to others. Can we go play paintball up north? Can we be seen playing violent video games? We don't want to be seen as terrorists. So that internalization of that securitization is something that's carried through now for decades. So I think the impact has to be considered both systemically, but also in terms of the affective registers of Islamophobia and how those policies transcend and translate into responses from Muslim communities.
Quick follow-up, Madam Chair.
Yes.
Professor Zine, do you think it's time for us to review the anti-terrorism code?
I think along with other policies that I've mentioned, I think to take a serious approach to tackling Islamophobia, that is, well overdue.